Good morning. I'm Curtis Cravens. I'm with the Mayor's Office of Recovery and Resiliency, and I'm pleased to be here today on behalf of ORR and Dan Zarilli, who could not be here today. He's had a baby boy in the last 8 days, and so he is where he belongs. And so I'm pleased to be here on ORR. I'm Senior Advisor for Coastal Resiliency for the Mayor's Office of Recovery and Resiliency. And one of the reasons I'm pleased to be here is because we have no stronger working relationship than with the Parks Department. It's one of our most key partnerships. And so I'm pleased to be able to frame this from the Mayor's Office. Just a few remarks. One is that, as you know, post-Sandy, the city's been in receipt of a lot of funding. We're currently underway on about $2.1 billion worth of funded projects that are either in feasibility, planning, design, and moving towards implementation. We're working on the east shore of Staten Island with the Army Corps, and that's going to go into design next year. We're working in the Rockaways and Jamaica Bay with the Army Corps. That's got a little longer horizon. We're working in Red Hook. We're underway, as many of you know, on East Side Coastal Resiliency, south of 23rd Street, and then moving down into Lower Manhattan. We are underway, hopefully, with Parks on planning for East Harlem waterfront. So we're really working on a tremendous number of projects across. We're working in Breezy Point. And so we are going now. And I think one of the things I wanted to say, God, I have another minute, sorry, is that one, as a Prospect Park board member for 12 years, nothing prepared me for what the space that we're in today. A nice, high, cozy elevation park does not prepare you for working in a low-lying elevation in the coastal zone with parks. It's a challenge, as we heard earlier today, for the planners, for the designers, for the engineers, for the operators of parks. And it really calls on us we're living this moment right now across the portfolio, and it takes tremendous collaboration, and we need problem solvers in this space. And we've been talking about, since post-Sandy in our office, of how we protect the city, and also how we enhance the fabric of the city. And we are saying, I'm thinking in our parks, I'm going to say in our portfolio, 70% of it is on park land. And so not only are the parks being reconfigured in a post-industrial and post-maritime landscape as we are inhabiting and connecting to our water's edge, we are using these parks, but not only do the parks have to perform a protection, but they also have to be enhanced in and of themselves for their natural resources, for their active and passive recreation. And this is not an easy balance. And the people you're going to hear from today are people who are working on this in this moment. There's not a lot of precedent to draw from to get this balance right. And I just want to say that it's been a privilege for me, and continues to be a privilege every day, working with each of the people you're going to hear from today. And I want to start off with saying how pleased I am to turn this over to a friend and a colleague and a speaker of truth, Alyssa Cobb.
Thanks, Curtis. Hi, everyone. I'm Alyssa Cobb Konan. I run the Planning and Parklands Division at the Parks Department, and it's a lot of fun to be here. As Curtis said, this is one of the most challenging things we're working on today in the Parks Department, and I'm sure through both the discussion today, as well as perhaps the reason you're in this room, is because it is one of the most challenging things to be working on. As we all know, New York City is surrounded by water. It's a coastal city. Our relationship with the water was and continues to be foundational. The foundation has changed, whether it's economic or physical, over the centuries, but one constant is the water itself. It's been both a friend, it's shown in a picture like this, but also an often and changeable creature, sometimes softly lulling the shoreline, but also battering our shorelines with storms, waves, and flooding. So for a very long time, in fact, we've continued to search and to find equilibrium with the water, sometimes successfully, sometimes not. But it's in this context that coastal resiliency, we find ourselves today interested in continuing to find that equilibrium with the water as best as possible, in a context where, of course, water is one of the strongest forces of nature that exist. So in the context of parks, we have over 29,982 acres, but who's counting? And half of that parkland sits on the waterfront. So 12,390 acres is on the waterfront. It has a real range and variety. There's our natural areas, a picture of Pelham Bay Park in the Bronx, to our more formalized shorelines, esplanades. This is Hunters Point South, talk about Lowline in Queens. And I think, Curtis, you guessed absolutely correctly. Parks makes up 70% of the city owns waterfront, or about a third of the overall city portfolio of waterfront properties. So we are very much in the mix of thinking about our coastlines, and it's also critical to our portfolio because it is half of our portfolio that's by the waterfront. It's not a surprise in a post-industrial city that that's indeed the case. Waterfront parks, there we are. They of course allow us to touch the water. This is a picture of Orchard Beach. We have many miles of beaches in New York City. We also have beautiful views. This is Coney Island, Steeple Chase Pier, and people use this for active recreational fishing, as seen here, as well as gathering places. Example of Pier 1 at Hudson River Park, an opportunity to experience the waterfront, so very varied. And finally, these spaces are also very vital to our communities in a city, of course, where real estate is at a premium. Finding space for recreational use is often, this is one of the few places where we can find that real estate and have found that real estate over these years. Additionally, of course, parks, as was mentioned earlier at the introductory comments, are an essential part of both our infrastructure for the city as well as our quality of life. And these incredible benefits are also where we find some of the most challenges as we prepare for climate change. I liked some of the comments from earlier about the edge and porosity. I mean, talk about that in this context. Here we are. So in Hurricane Sandy, 39% of parkland was flooded. We anticipate through sea level rise that by 21,000, about 62% of our parks will be within the flood zone. Here is a picture after Hurricane Sandy of East River Park. So flooding, increased coastal storms and flooding continue to present a challenge for us on an increased basis. And then more specifically, of course, we're planning for this hopefully to not happen with as great frequency. This is the Rockaway Boardwalk, for those of you who are not familiar with it, which obviously both ruined the boardwalk, but also was a safety risk for the rest of the community. After Hurricane Sandy, just that one storm alone was over $800 million of documented damage for Parks Department properties. Of course, we have inland challenges as well as opportunities for respite as heat waves increase in frequency, temperatures increase, our pools continue to provide a place of respite for New Yorkers. And also we're taking the challenge, which I think will be spoken about in other sessions today as well, to increase both street trees and greenery within the park system interior to our parkland as well, through tree plantings and green infrastructure, lighter pavement materials. We welcome greatly our partnership with DEP and managing stormwater, as that's pretty critical to both, of course, coastal pieces, but also as well as inland flooding. And more specifically, we are looking at two ways of addressing resiliency in our parks. One is building specific resiliency measures into each new park retrofit and creating community-wide protection plans. I am told I am out of time. I had a couple more slides. I'll try to sort of give you a sense of what they were. Generally, we have some examples here of where we've put in new construction materials, how we're elevating high investment amenities on higher ground, incorporating stormwater management in some of our parks. This is an example of our Community Parks Initiative park. Continuing salt marsh restoration where we can. This is an example from 2014 where we did about a 16-acre restoration. We're summarizing a lot of this through our design guidelines that we're going to be releasing later in the year, highlighting some of the work we've been doing and continue to hope to do in coordination with ORR. And as Curtis mentioned, we have a number of very large planning initiatives, very much done in the context of partnership with the mayor's office, some of which are listed here. I'm going to skip through my Rockaway slides, which were examples of specifically how we've been doing that. I think just in closing, I think the challenge for parks is how to become part of a foundation of resiliency without compromising our parks and the recreational space that makes up a half of our park system. I look forward to hearing from the panel as we very much work together, continue to find that equilibrium with the water. I think Michael is next.
Thanks, Alyssa. I'm Michael Marrella. I'm the Director of Waterfront and Open Space Planning at the New York City Department of City Planning. I also get to be your moderator today. So I'm just going to take a second to introduce the panel and just to give you the run of the show. We're going to be starting with 3 presentations from 3 tremendously distinguished speakers. Their bios are in your booklet, so I won't waste time on telling you just how great they are, or you could just trust me. They will be highlighting a couple of the projects that they've worked on about resiliency, both here in New York City and elsewhere. Because I think there's a lot that we should be proud of the work that we're doing in New York, and a lot directly addressing the challenges that were discussed earlier today. But it's also about looking beyond New York City and understanding what we can learn from elsewhere. So I want to just say, though, that we've talked a lot about the challenges of resiliency, the challenges that parks face in the upcoming decades and centuries. But it was a colleague of mine, the planner in New York, John Shapiro, who said several years ago, then this was before Hurricane Sandy, that the way in which policymakers and placemakers respond to the risks of climate change will have as great, if not greater, of an impact than how we responded to the introduction of the automobile in the shape of the city. And I don't think that could be understated, because what we do physically to address the risks that we face are going to have long-lasting effects and very much alter fundamentally how we go about our life within the city. And so our park space is an incredibly important resource that we have. It is also, as we learned during Hurricane Sandy, it is literally at the forefront of the climate risks that we face. We have 1/3 of the entirety of the city's waterfront in New York City within the hands of just the New York City Department of Parks and Recreation. That's not even to say the amount of park space that's within the federal parklands, for instance. But with that, we have this incredible challenge. So I'm excited for the conversation today. After the short presentations, I'll ask a few questions, but then we want to open this up for engagement with all of you and to continue the dialogue. So let me turn it over to Pippa Brashear from Scape Landscape Architects for the first presentation.
Great. So I'm Pippa Brashear from Scape, as Michael said. I think one of the things in New York City has been mentioned is our parks are different. And today we're really asking our waterfront parks to do more. And what we have to realize is that in New York City, it's not one type. We don't have one type of waterfront. And I think what I want to talk a little bit about today is thinking beyond the bulkhead. And maybe even beyond the beach and the berm. In our waterfront parks, there's been a big focus on how parks can resist coastal flooding, but I think that there's a really wide range of ways that the parks can be resilient to coastal flooding and help contribute to risk reduction, and maybe that doesn't always mean keeping the water out. And so I wanted to touch on three lessons that we've kind of learned in our practice on the waterfront that looks at these sort of risk reduction strategies. One is thinking in layers, looking beyond the land and really taking into account the water itself. And designing to encourage stewardship, because it's the same as we look at climate change. We have limited budgets, and we need to think about how we're going to be addressing that long term. So I'm the project manager at Scape for our project Living Breakwaters, which was a Rebuild by Design competition-winning project that is now being implemented by New York State Governor's Office of Storm Recovery, but is working very closely in partnership with the Parks Department, because most of that shoreline that you see is Conference House Park. Living breakwaters are off the shore. These are rock structures, rock and concrete structures in the water designed to attenuate waves in storms, but also to build beaches, to give back parkland that has eroded over time, and also build those beaches to help contribute to risk reduction. So these breakwaters are going to be designed to do many things, to contribute to that risk reduction, to provide habitat, to help create recreational nearshore waters and beach. But what they don't do is keep the water out. And so they aren't a object in isolation, as Signe touched on, this idea of multi-purpose infrastructure. They're a piece of a layered shoreline. And so one of the key things when we think about parks and resilience is thinking not about the shoreline as a line or that mean high water line, but really as a thickened section and as a space in which people as well as creatures can inhabit. We also, in doing this project, have really thought in thematic layers about not only risk reduction, but ecology and culture, being people. So when you get out into the water and have to think in the water, there's a whole new set of constituents and client base, both the fish and creatures that live there, but also the fishermen and the people who use the water. And so this is a whole new set of tools and types of ways of looking and surveying. So we really need to expand the way that we actually look at the water and the types of surveys and studies that we do. These are some of our ecologists in the water looking at rocky habitat nearby to say what might grow and come there. And so these are the types of drawings and designs that are evolving out of that process. And a real expansion and experimentation of the materials that we use on the waterfront, and an engagement of different techniques for restoration. And this brings me to the last point about stewardship. These are techniques that are designed to restore oysters to the harbor. Oysters were a historic creature and habitat off the south shore of Staten Island. I think that video is still going, sorry. But actually, more than anything, this is a engagement tool. This is a stewardship tool. We're partnering with the Billion Oyster Project, who many of you may know, the Harbor School of the Billion Oyster Project in the harbor. If you haven't heard about them, I can answer questions. You should look them up. They have a school on Governor's Island, but they also are engaging middle school students throughout the city in stewarding the water and the waterfront. Part of the project is actually designing the space to engage their activities as well as the activities of New York City Parks Department and Conference House Park. The team at Conference House Park has been an amazing partner in terms of really envisioning the way that the Living Breakwaters project and the onshore project, the Tottenville Shoreline Protection Project, could create an amenity for the park and activities. And part of this process has really been engaging people in the design. And that's important because these projects on the waterfront and resilience are very complex. They take time, and it's really important to really engage people in the process and build that sense of ownership. We're also dealing with some pretty complex issues, so strategies to engage and visualize these things. This was sort of an interactive design that would enable people to visualize what these breakwaters might look like. And sometimes it just means getting out on the ground. We spent a lot of time out on the shore there and doing beach cleanups and things like that have really started to get people to see the project and understand the place through eyes of resilience. So, thank you.
Ronnie Deitz. I'm with Arcadis, and we were the lead consultants on the Coney Island Creek Resiliency Study Project. It was led by New York City Economic Development Corporation in partnership with ORR, Curtis Cravens, and New York City Parks and Recreation. So I know we've seen a lot of am I allowed to walk around? Yeah? Stay put? Okay. That's fine. So I know we've seen a lot of maps, but one of the things that I think is important to call out as I start to frame this study is just how much low-lying area we have to deal with. So as we're thinking about how we want to protect this shoreline and how we want to significantly reduce flood risk for those in the area, it's not enough to just look at one little piece in isolation. We need to look at this as a system. So some of the goals of the study and a little bit of background as we focus in on Coney Island Creek is that during Hurricane Sandy, Coney Island Creek was the main source, main source of flooding was the back door. And really what this showed us was that it's not only what you think when you see where the waves are coming from. You have a funneling effect and you have waves coming in from behind. So one of the key initiatives that came out of a stronger, more resilient New York, the city's coastal resiliency plan, was to understand the feasibility of a tidal barrier and wetland concept. What was also so great about this project was that it wasn't only flood protection. It's how do you integrate hydrologic management? How do you improve waterfront open space? How do you do these secondary benefits of connecting communities? And are there opportunities for economic development as well? So some of the flood protection alignments that we looked at just quickly, and these are just lines as we look at how we want to begin to think through the shoreline. I'll go into detail on what these actual typologies are in a minute. So if you see kind of at the mouth of Coney Island Creek or at Calvert Box Park, could you move something more inland as you look at Six Diamonds Park? Could you do something along the shoreline? Or are there opportunities to significantly reduce flood risk without using structures or flood protection items and look at more wetlands and recontouring, so some greener opportunities? One in particular alignment that we as a study team felt was significant in not only reducing flood risk and having that opportunity, but also could layer in community benefits was this alignment at Six Diamonds Park. So what are these parks in Coney Island? We have Coney Island Creek Park, we have Kaiser Park, we have Six Diamonds Park, and we have Calvert Box Park. And it's, again, going back to what Alyssa said and what Curtis said, we have so much of this shoreline that's also vulnerable right along the waterfront, parks owned. So the major creek parks are also very active space. We have Six Diamonds Park, 51% active. You have Kaiser Park, 44%. And you also have Calvert Box Park, which has a master plan construction currently in progress. So as we think about how we bring flood protection to this area, we also want to be sensitive to that. We don't want to be recreating the wheel. We don't want to be duplicating efforts. We want to be merging and integrating into this park space, and we also want to be enhancing it. So we don't want to take away from the active recreation. We don't want to not be coordinating with parks as we're thinking about master plans. So what could these items look like as we begin to interweave flood protection into Coney Island and its shoreline parks? So you could do something like a vertical wall, which if you start at the top left corner is something that has the smallest footprint, but also has the least type of opportunity to enhance in other forms and bring in secondary benefits, all the way down to the levee, which has a 3-to-1 back slope in this bottom corner, which is a larger footprint, but you can start to add in bike paths, you can start to add in community infrastructure and living shorelines and ecology, because as Pippa said, it's more than just a item in one transect, but you need to think kind of throughout that whole space. So one typology that we looked at could be something with promenades, levees, bulkheads. We have a flood barrier that would connect between the two sides of the park to now bring this new connection to an area that prior had really difficult ways to get there by foot, and you would need a car to get between the two. And then you also have an opportunity for floodable space. As you start to weave this alignment in, what can be done now in this blue area that's a region that could flood, but also during the times when it's not raining could be used for other opportunities, which could be beaches, dunes, fishing, boat launches, passive parks, salt marshes. So this was one typology that we just kind of brought together as our conceptual plan, which could show how you'd have fishing piers, habitat-enhanced shorelines, tidal marshes, and could basically turn this into a real system and not only bring flood protection, but bring an integrated approach into the park space that layers in ecology, layers in protection, and enhances the experience for a park goer in Coney Island. So, can talk about these more during Q&A, but you could basically along the park space take what was existing dense vegetation, which has its difficulties for safety, visibility, access, and change it into a living shoreline habitat restoration with new flood protection to protect against the 100-year storm. Another opportunity at Six Diamonds. And then Kaiser Park, where you have this low-lying area, you know you have an intertidal zone, and could you raise this in such a way that you're not interfering with active recreation and baseball fields, that you're enhancing the intertidal zone as you get to the water and changing that experience one more. We looked at pedestrian crossings, and I know that this was in Alyssa's deck, but just kind of a visual of what a new Coney Island Creek resilient park space could look like. With that, I'm going to turn it over to David Waggoner.
Good morning. I'm from New Orleans, so this is a bit further away and broader scale. To get an architect to think about parks or streets or canals or nature is a sort of reversion to root. But in the 1850s in Rotterdam, one of the most famous plans made in Europe was the Rosa Plan, which looked at the entirety of the city as a system of canals. The value of that, though, as a parkland, as an integral part of Rotterdam, still there, the highest value. So what we did in New Orleans after Katrina was look holistically at the city. We put out these documents on itslivingwithwater.com if you want to see it. What we propose is that the city becomes this natural network. It becomes a blue-green network of a living water system so that the entirety of the city reverted closer to a natural system using the elements that are there. If you examine what you have in your urban landscape, much of it is not attractive, but it's not so difficult if we use a little design to improve and create these corridors that can run then through the city. Or if we look at our parklands, and this is another parish, Jefferson Parish, what can we do to flood this instead of the street around? Because urban flooding is quite a problem in New Orleans. We still have, though, I don't think we've fixed much of anything, but we've understood how. We still have parks that are doing exactly the wrong things. They're draining the park and into the street, into the system, instead of holding the park with land. This park, Audubon Park, if you come to New Orleans, is sort of, according to my Dutch friends, a world's worst practice. Dragging out groundwater that's brackish, having to oxygenate the water, and then flooding the streets around it. We have another park in New Orleans, this very large city park, that is now looking at holding a lot of water. You see almost 1,000 acre-feet of water can be held on this site, taking the flooding from the neighborhood around and then flooding this park, creating a different identity for the park, but using the space that's inherent there and to increase the habitat. If you look then at how that becomes a sort of core of the message and a way to connect into the city, you look at where City Park is and the old canal that was there, the bayou that we have, still the only really urban water that's inside the city today, where there were thousands of people Sunday. And then you look at what we have when it comes to the urban system. So how do we then look at how to connect all that, rejuvenate that, take the stormwater flooding out, and create this new urban place, our version of a High Line, sort of, which is the Lafitte Blue Way. We say it's only a bike path at present, but of course the interval or the different mode that these parks can operate in is the key thing for us to understand. They're not always wet, they're not always dry. What they're doing, though, is contributing to a system. And in New Orleans, we have subsidence, which is mainly a problem when it's dry. How do we take that fresh water and circulate it through a system that involves these residual outfall canals? So you have residual elements of your infrastructure in the city, and we have these walls left from the Corps of Engineers that weren't removed after they moved the flood defense system. And how do we then get that down to rejuvenate the real estate in the place that we have as a city with 26 miles of protected waterways? And then how do we make this the way that the future city is read, the life is lived, the opportunities exist? This isn't really that advanced. I have to say that America is in some ways laggard. Singapore is not, and you see they've taken that condition and turned it to this condition in Bishan Park. So it isn't really as difficult as we seem to be making it, but we have to go back and say, well, what do we want it to be? So the question of what we want to park this Jakarta, what this man wants is a fish. But if we take the NDRC application for New Orleans, which was in Gentilly, we have to go back and pay attention to the natural system that was there. The condition on the left is what the real landscape was. What we have currently is this piped system, and then we need to work with the urban form now. We have these projects, only part of which were funded with NDRC. Next to New York City, we got the largest grant. But what was the folly of man? Really, you think that's going to work? You're going to stick that thing out there in that muck, and it's going to drain it, and it's going to work, right? So how long do we fight nature? Do we really think in the future we can win that, or do we understand that we're part of this and we need to work with it? And if we do, we live in a better, cooler, greener, bluer place with benefits that we can demonstrate, but effects we must measure. And I don't know how much in your system of parks we've really put in monitoring systems and we know what's going on and where all this is working, but we intend in New Orleans to make our city smarter in lots of ways. hopefully a place that you want to come, and that each neighborhood, each district has its own park. Thanks.
So thank you. Thanks for the 3 presentations. So we're gonna start with the Q&A. I'm gonna ask a few questions, and then I'll very quickly open the floor. So I'd like to hear everyone else's thoughts. But with the prerogative of being moderator, I'll selfishly ask a couple questions myself. So one of the things that strikes me, and Ronnie, I think one of your slides showing the kit of parts showed the top left image of the wall. And that is by far the cheapest and most efficient, space-efficient way of likely preventing flooding. From the perspective of all 3 of you, and try to answer this question concisely, why not just build walls?
Okay, yeah. Well, I mean, I think part of this goes back to needing to find a better way to value the things we put in our urban space, right? So if we evaluate the purpose and function of an infrastructure that we build for one single purpose, to keep floodwater out, then yeah, the wall wins every time. But, you know, we're a waterfront city. We know there's economic benefits to waterfront development. We know there's ecological things that we value. We are still we're still a working waterfront city, and those things drop precipitously if we just build a wall. So I think that a lot of it comes back to really articulating the value system. I think one added point on that, and it's particular some of the things that David talked about, and I think that we embraced in the Living Breakwaters project, isn't there are going to be places where you just have to say, what if we can't keep water out? And there are going to be places in every city and every town and every state where it's not, when you weigh all those benefits, taking everything into account, where it's not going to be there. Where we're working in the South Shore of Staten Island, it's not as dense. People live there because they want to be on the water. And so different strategies that address risk in different ways without keeping water out, too.
So I guess the first thing, a wall is not always the cheapest. And I think that's a shift in also perception that maybe there is a cheaper way to keep water out if we wanted to, so we shouldn't only go to what would be the most, I hate the word cheap, but the what's going to get it done in the shortest amount of time and for the least amount of dollar. But then there's 2 other parts to that. Funding. So even if we assume it's the cheapest, we don't always have money to do these studies, these flood protection projects, and especially in the case of Coney Island, we're still looking to figure out how to fund this entire system. So if we start to think outside the box of just a wall and layer in those additional benefits, perhaps there's other opportunities to collaborate and find funding to realize these flood protection opportunities. The other point to make is that flood wall is really hard to adapt. And I think that we need to acknowledge that this is dynamic, that we have climate change, we have climate risk, we have sea level rise. And if we're going to make an investment now, how do we ensure that that's an investment that can continue to grow with the community as we move forward? So perhaps there's something out there that can continue to evolve with community needs or sea level rise or other risks that might face an area. So that's kind of some of the other benefits of thinking to the other opportunities beside the wall.
David, do you have any thoughts?
Well, I live in a wall city. I mean, the Corps of Engineers, with the system that failed after the storm, they came and they built the walls again. And so we didn't have a lot of say in that. It's a sort of example of what you don't want to do. I think Fukushima after the storm, there's an instance I know where the wall is there and you're living next to the sea, but now you can't see the sea. So why do I live there if I'm going to live next to the wall? 2 other points, I think, that Candace Damon, who's with HRNA, says, when she sees these residual walls in New Orleans, she thinks something is worse than it is because she doesn't really know where the water is. Out of sight is out of mind. We can't manage what we can't see. Maybe 3 other things, or 2 more. I had a friend from the Czech Republic there, and she said, this is deep in the soul of an Eastern European, right? It's deep in our soul, too, although people may think, in other words, the wall is the separator. who's on the other side is always there. Well, nature's on the other side. The last point being that the wall stops the migration of the ecosystem, and it will cut off all the ability of what's out there to migrate, and that would not be in the long-term interest.
So then, and I'm curious, for the projects that you've worked on, how have you convinced policymakers like myself and elected officials and then the public at large that we have to take into consideration these other elements? So the Living Breakwaters, I think, is a really good example where this was played out, but you're not stopping the water. You're actually taking a drastically different approach. And so how were you able to successfully make that argument?
A lot of conversation, a lot of asking people what they cared about, and also a lot of study that was about, engineering modeling and things like that were about what are the conditions that are actually in that particular place. So I think the slide that I showed of like what breakwaters do and don't, and then they have keep the water out, that was something we developed during the Rebuild by Design competition, and a lot of people were like, you can't show that slide. People are just going to laugh you out of the room. People are going to say, what do you mean you're not protecting us and you're keeping the water out? We show the slide. There were a lot of engaged residents in Staten Island, and we started having this conversation about, but it's going to attenuate the waves, and could that change the V zone, and that changed my base flood elevation. It was a really intelligent and thoughtful conversation about how it was reducing risk, and that came from people who knew the waterfront. So I think just not being afraid to have those conversations is the first step. And the second, what I mentioned about modeling and things, we tend to sort of put things in the FEMA bucket, and I think we need to step outside of that and think about, looking at erosion, looking at wave action, really thinking about the risk of the particular place that you're at, and designing and engineering for that.
Then Ronnie, did you have similar conversations in the public for the Coney Island Creek project?
Absolutely, and I think education is such a huge component of getting the community, getting politicians, stakeholders on board. And I know that actually in the case of Coney Island, the community was great in that they wanted green, they wanted wetlands, they still do, and we're going to integrate all of that into whatever plan is realized for the creek. And it's how you take that layered approach to significantly achieve flood risk reduction in the case of higher flood insurance premiums for regions such as Coney Island, but also how you make those ecological benefits or live with water and the education part that comes along. And then also just knowing that we're looking at park space for a large portion of where these flood protection measures would potentially live. How do we enhance that space? I think there's a stewardship, there's a conversation, there's a duty to not only build a wall or just look at flood protection, but if we're designing against a storm that statistically is going to happen once every 100 years, so 1% of the time, how do you make that experience better for the 99% of the time that everyone's feet are dry?
Quickly, when I see the park that's flooded, I think the park is doing probably what it should do, which is get flooded at that 1% or that event in Bridgeport where we work, the Olmsted Park flooded. Well, the loss in Bridgeport was so small that there really wasn't much claim you could make with FEMA because there aren't many losses because the park did the work that it needed to do. The unknown, the uncertainty is sea level rise. So if something is 3 or 5 or 10 feet above and sea level rise is rising 3 or 5 or 10 feet, it's very different when this becomes open water and water bottom. So we're dealing in a world of radical uncertainty, and the park is sort of a hedge against that, the edge part.
Well, that raises us to what I think is going to be my last question before we open it up. But thinking ahead. So let's assume we're thinking even just 5 years out. 5 years out, 10 years out, the federal funding from the post-Sandy funding that is billions upon billions of dollars is being spent down. And we have to, as a city, make very tough decisions about how we fund these things going forward. Once it becomes it's a question of how does resiliency become just mainstreamed into the capital planning and capital design projects for the Parks Department as well as every other agency and every individual. But how do we begin to then put resiliency as a priority when the memory of Sandy fades? David, why don't we start with you, since you've lived through Katrina and that's now over 10 years out.
Yeah, no, the money goes away. And it gets spent in ways that maybe you wish you hadn't spent it. That's the caution. A lot of it gets spent on administration. That's a challenge, to get the money to where it should be. But part of where it should be is a strategy forward. You have to have. That's why there's this sort of overall view of New Orleans. If we had had that before, maybe we wouldn't have some of the current capital investments we have. I think you need to think about. You need to go to where the cause is. I saw the NDRC application. Nobody from Kansas here. But is there? But they were trying to deal with water that's collected against the back of the levee and pump it out instead of dealing with the paving of the farmland up the slope. Excuse me, it was Tennessee. But the point is, where's the cost? So if you look inside Manhattan up the slope, start there. Don't let this be an edge condition only problem. And the parks can do much more within the city. Each park should be doing more. What is the metric you need done? And then how do you change the protocols of your capital projects now so that in the future they're all building in the right approaches, and you go up and you try to work everywhere and make sure you know how to you can move. We aren't trees ourselves, but we need to mitigate the effects.
Any thoughts before we open it up?
I think one thing on that is, one of the imperatives, and it's very, very hard given the nature of the funding that we have, but is to monitor and come up with metrics for the success of the things that we are building now that we're trying to innovate, and metrics in other ways than flood protection. So if we want to justify building these type of multi-purpose projects in the future, well, we're going to have to justify it because they provide a public health benefit, because they provide an economic benefit. And so institutionalizing that and making sure that we do that now is really important. And then, what I'd said about stewardship, we need to engage agency partners, community partners in figuring out how we're going to make this maintainable over time.
And then just piggybacking on that, I think education with the community is so important, and understanding that water isn't something that we need to keep on the other side of that flood wall. It's something that we can live with, and understanding how to protect from the really large events, but how we deal with water, how we interact with it in a beneficial way, and not only worry about the huge walls, but letting it creep in and finding that balance.
Great. So now we're going to open the conversation to the floor. There's a runner in the back. I saw the first hand in the way back, and I think I see that's Steve.
Hi, I have a question. I think it mainly directs to David. It's a parks conference today. We saw a lot of park examples here of parks as the point of resilience. Parks may actually be the easiest place to talk about doing this, and I think the question for David is that though the work in New Orleans incorporated a lot of work with parks and open space, how hard or difficult is it to cross that line into residential communities, into private property, where the parks can't do the job, and how does that affect the thinking?
Thanks, Steve. We were in one of these meetings at night. You have a lot of meetings at night, and somebody said to me, if you don't tell these people something they can do about it, there's no point in their being here. And so it became more and more evident that at the parcel level, it was important to communicate, and people doing things at the parcel level. In fact, the Norfolk scheme that won NDRC is based on parcel level action. You can only do so much of the math at the parcel level, but you get the citizens involved at that level. Basically, we were looking at space and where we can do it. So if we got in a suburban area, you had to do it at the parcel level, or you had to do it between the sidewalk and the curb, or we had to do it in the street. I think that the big opportunity we have in New Orleans, but across the country, is to reimagine our streets. We have seemed to have made those streets as wide and single purpose as possible. They're wonderful signs in New York of people thinking about them differently, but they're about timid for a bowl city. I mean, go ahead and take the asphalt out, please. Cut the thing open, start to open this up, so that you do deal with it at every scale, at your block scale, at your neighborhood scale. Where's the place that's getting greener in the park? I have a friend who many years ago advocated that every 50 years a building in Manhattan should be reviewed. Should it stay? If not, we need more green space. So I think some aggressive action toward greening is really important. And we just have to look everywhere. The street is, though, in New Orleans, because we have $1.2 billion to spend on streets. If we do it the same way the engineers have always done it, so much the loss.
Another question, right here in the front.
Yes, hi.
Why don't you wait for the microphone so we
Oh,
can get
okay, thank you. I agree with David 100%. I'm a Coney Island resident and I sit on a couple of these committees here. No walls. When you put up walls, they become this bathtub effect, and then what happens to the water? But one of the things that I believe is that we need to start looking at all of the water as one body of water. Instead of Jamaica Bay, Coney Island Creek, Staten Island, it's all the Atlantic Flyaway. And whatever you do to one part of that water, it's going to affect the others. Case in hand, what happened to Coney Island after one of the storms, they filled in the Army Corps of Engineers filled up the sand on the beach side, but it created a horrible condition, a dangerous condition on the creek side. We actually had 20-foot surge in Coney Island, so that's a lot of water. That's water that we really realistically are not trying to keep out, but we're trying to find ways to mitigate the flooding and make sure it's less and the recovery is a lot sooner. So this is a golden opportunity, being that everything has pretty much been destroyed. Instead of just building it back, build it back better, where it won't happen again.
Very well said. Yeah.
So I think you hit on some great points, and I think one of the biggest successes of the Coney Island Creek study is that it evolved into a Coney Island resiliency study, and the word creek became a secondary portion because it is a regional approach. And we acknowledge that you can't just protect the creek, or something you do along the creek has to be absorbed throughout the entire system. So working with the Army Corps for the Jamaica Bay reformulation study, how do we also partner with them so that Coney Island becomes a part of their thinking and that flood protection is continuous, or flood risk reduction? And how do we acknowledge that there are those secondary benefits that come with acknowledging this complete system, whether it's community infrastructure, whether it's opportunities to expand the greenway, things like that. Because building just bathtub walls isn't gonna solve anything. So I think you're completely right there, and the opportunity would be, as David said, a great loss if we just continue to compartment these things and let engineers do what they like to do.
Great. I think we have time for one last question.
Can I make a plug for Michael first, though? Because I think that, I think one thing is thinking about the water as a system has been said, and as like our sixth borough. And so I think, even before Sandy, the Waterfronts group and the Vision 2020 really started thinking that way. And I believe you guys are kicking off the next planning.
That's right.
Phase, right?
The next city's
get
comprehensive
involved.
waterfront plan is coming out in the year 2020, so we have about 4 years to prep for it. But we're starting that discussions now. But one last question right up in the front.
Hi, Rob Freudenberg, Regional Plan Association. Great panel, thank you, everyone. I was wondering, building on that kind of monitoring situation, I'm wondering, post-Sandy, we're in something of a wild west of resilience where different laboratory of strategies are being tried throughout the city. Do we have a governance system in place, or the projects themselves have monitoring in place to let us know which things are working so that we can keep investing in the right things in the future?
Do you want to talk about your monitoring?
Yeah. That's a big question, and I think one thing that folks should know is this CDBGDR funding does not fund long-term maintenance and monitoring, so it's really important for everyone to really think creatively about this. This has been a topic of conversation amongst a broad array of people from the public, private, and non-governmental sectors. And there's actually been a group of folks around the city, folks from DCP Waterfronts, from NYPIC, from New York State DEC, from New York City Parks Department, from the Science and Resiliency Institute of Jamaica Bay, Arcadis, Scape, a couple people who've really been working on putting together some grant applications for long-term monitoring strategies for coastal marine infrastructure. We just submitted a grant to NYSERDA. Hopefully they grant it. But one of the conversations there is specifically, what do we monitor to reflect those values, and how do we create not wildly complex monitoring protocols that sit on the shelf, but a sort of a prioritized, focused set of monitoring protocols that non-governmental organizations, community groups can help contribute to. It's about getting some data and getting it out there to use.
Well, I'm afraid that's all the time we have for today. Obviously, a lot more to discuss, a lot more monitoring to do as well. But I want to thank all of you for your time and attention today, and thanks to the Parks Department for setting up today's discussions. Thank you.